In this video I'm going to try and persuade you that the Seize the Initiative role can go die in a fire. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now today is very much going to be a personal opinion type video, rather than out and out strategy, so please if you disagree with everything, please let me know down in the comments and let's get some discussion going. Today's subject of discussion is the Seize the Initiative role in Warhammer 40k, and why I don't really think it needs to be a thing anymore, particularly in the new chapter approved mission set. For those that aren't aware or don't play 8th regularly, the Seize the Initiative role happens at the start of the game. Basically what happens is that both players set up their army as per the rules of the deployment in whatever mission that they happen to be playing. One player will be going first and the other player will be going second, and at least in the new mission rules, it's generally going to be known who's going first and who's going second before anyone's deployed any models. Then you come to the first turn, and the person who was going second can elect to try and seize the initiative. They roll a single dice, and if they roll a 6, then the order reverses, and it is the player who was going to be going second who goes first instead. It's a bit of a shaking up sort of rule. It can completely turn a game on its head, and force you to have to think about things very differently. So let's take a look at some of the positives and negatives behind this game mechanic. We'll start with the positives first. Firstly, it's a very memorable role. It certainly adds some serious drama and tension to the game, as there's very few times that one dice roll can make such a big impact to the rest of the game, and it's certainly very memorable when one player seizes the initiative, and what might have been an easy fight goes to a much more close game, as is sometimes the case, though if it memorably turns an even game into a complete rout, it might be memorable and dramatic for entirely the wrong reasons. Secondly, and perhaps the most importantly in terms of making a more balanced game, it can incentivize the player who's going first to maybe try and be a little bit more cautious with their deployment. If they literally just set up every single up out of cover, ready to move and do maximal damage turn 1, then if the opponent does seize, they could wind up leaving themselves in a very bad exposed position indeed. So at least with some units, it might still make sense for them to deploy, say, out of line of sight behind cover, even if it costs them a little bit of shooting power, if their exposure and the opponent's seizing is literally going to be the difference between victory and defeat. I'd say in terms of a game balance perspective, this is by far the best aspect of Seize the Initiative, and is a genuine positive, though I'm not sure it entirely works out as intended, as we'll mention later. Next, in some certain matchups where one army is looking like it's really in a bad situation, then having the advantage of a surprise Seize the Initiative roll could be the only thing that they really have to get a decent leg up on their opponent in the early game, and might genuinely lead to a lot more of a balanced game. The thing is that this is an ideal scenario. In reality, the Seize the Initiative buff is kind of randomly applied. You're just as likely to seize with a really powerful army that was about to go second, therefore making an uneven matchup even more uneven, and giving your poor opponent with a weaker army another surprising huge obstacle. I think that the deployment rules that go with Seize the Initiative really are the make or break factor here. Basically in some of the old chapter approved missions where you had alternating deployment of units, basically being seized on didn't really make too much difference, as you'd already had multiple opportunities to out-deploy your opponent, and there usually wasn't any certainty that you were going first while you were deploying. It just combined with the initial roll for first turn and the +1 that the player who finished deploying first got to be part of the same mechanic, meaning that the player who finished deploying first would in general have a slightly higher chance of going first when deployment had happened. In games with deployment like this, seize really isn't such a bad mechanic, and it doesn't really add a whole load on top of that initial roll for first turn. So those are broadly the positives. My main problem with Seize the Initiative is when it's combined with the new chapter approved 2019 mission pack. I really like the mission pack as a whole. I think it does very well, and I've had a lot of fun games of it since it came out. Now the way it works with the chapter approved 2019 mission pack is that you roll off to become either the attacker or the defender at the start of the game, where if you're the attacker, you have to set up first, but you get the decision as to whether or not you go first. Basically the defender gets every single positioning advantage they can get. They get to choose the deployment zone side that they have, meaning that they're likely to have the lion's share of any good line of sight blocking terrain or other features that they want in their deployment zone. And also because they deploy their models after the attacker does, they essentially get to perfectly counter-deploy them, meaning that they could be matching up their anti-tank units versus opponents' tanks on the other side of the board, or the same with their anti-infantry weapons. They could be deploying to outrange your opponent's guns, or even just hide out of line of sight, so that certain units in your opponent's army might be a lot less able to fire at full effect on the first turn. I feel like all of this goes a long way to helping balance the first turn advantage that the attacker gets, so the game can be at least some semblance of even despite one person getting to fire all of their guns first. This is when I feel that the siege roll becomes problematic, because if the defender, who has now chosen their deployment zone and perfectly counter-deployed to the attacker, also randomly gets to go first 1 in every 6 games, it means that they've likely perfectly positioned their units to be most effective on the battlefield, so are likely to be in a position to deal a crippling blow to their opponent right from turn 1. You've just essentially given pretty much every single advantage to the defender, who's then gone on to seize, so you've basically made the game about as skewed as you can in 1 in every 6 games, due to that being how many times the seize the initiative roll is likely to take effect. Perhaps if all of the chapter approved missions had end of battle round scoring or something like that might help to even up things a little bit, as that's a powerful advantage that the second player can have, but not all of them even have that, so you might have been perfectly counter-deployed, got the worst deployment zone, had second turn, and then had no advantage whatsoever even on the objectives if you were unlucky enough to be seized on. This is particularly exacerbated if you don't have enough line of sight blocking terrain on the table, as this is certainly a factor that helps amp up alpha strikes, and gives either player a good chance more of losing more of their models on turn 1. I mentioned before that sometimes it can make an uneven matchup more even, but the thing is this seize mega advantage is randomly applied to one of the players, and it could just as easily make a pretty even matchup completely skewed, or give all of these advantages to the player who was actually in a better position just from army composition in the first place. In any sort of tactical competitive game, you want to avoid randomness where possible. Sure, risk management with dice is very important, and it's the most interesting thing about 40k, managing the different probabilities to try and give yourself the best chance of winning, but this one isn't really about managing probabilities, it's just completely arbitrarily giving one player a big advantage. As I mentioned before, my favourite aspect of the siege roll is that it can encourage the player going first to maybe be a little bit more conservative about deployment. But the thing is, when it only affects 1 in every 6 games, it's kind of borderline whether you actually make any effort to make your units deploy more conservatively in the first place, rather than just positioning them for the optimal alpha strike straight away. Because 5 out of every 6 games, that's going to be the better strategy. It's just going to be the one painful seize the initiative game you get that's really going to hamper you. And if you get lucky throughout the course of a tournament, that might never even happen to you. So it's still kind of in the player going first's interest just to be maximally aggressive and to optimise their alpha strike, rather than making any real effort to limit that alpha strike by keeping their units safe. So that's my main gripe with Seize the Initiative. I feel like it just stacks all of the benefits on one army, completely randomly in 1 out of every 6 games. Another minor issue that I've heard mentioned before is that it's one of the easiest ways that a unscrupulous player could cheat in the game. If you happen to have a dice that you know rolls 6s a little bit more regularly than it really should if it was balanced, then guess which dice the cheating player would be using to make that Seize the Initiative roll, as there's very few aspects where one dice roll can affect the entire game quite so much. Fortunately, this is very rare both in tournaments and in casual play, but I have heard examples of people with weighted dice being caught from time to time, generally when they've been using it to repeatedly seize the initiative over the course of a tournament. In all honesty though, this is a minor issue, and I'm mainly talking about game balance in this video. So overall, at least in the new chapter approved missions, I feel that it just adds an extra random advantage to most competitive games, particularly ones that don't have end of battle round scoring or something like that, and in more casual games, again it just leads to more random skew matches that are likely to be less fun for both players, as the game was likely going to be less balanced. The main reason I've been talking about this today is that I've been having some unfortunate games with Seize the Initiative recently, particularly at tournaments, and it's not because I'm salty of being seized on and losing. I've just had a fair few games where I've seized the initiative myself, and what was shaping up to be a close game turns into me just rolling a whole load of dice for the first turn and gunning a large portion of my opponent's army off the tabletop, turn 1, turning what was shaping up to be a fairly balanced game into a complete massacre, just because that one dice roll went my way, and it just doesn't really feel like a very satisfying way to win a game of 40k, where a competitive game has just been turned into a non-event by one random lucky roll of the dice. So let me know your opinions on the siege roll down in the comments below. I know that I've come down fairly one-sided on this issue, just due to my own experiences, and I do know that Seize the Initiative is in general quite a popular mechanic throughout the rest of the game because it does add some fun drama and excitement to a game that's mainly about pushing around model soldiers and making tactical decisions. If you can think of any obvious ways to modify it so the siege roll didn't mean quite as much of an overwhelming advantage to the player who just seized, then it would be good to know. I honestly think it's a bit of a tricky one to fix myself. If you'd like to hear more 40k Tactics related content, please feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have new 40k content coming out every single day, including lots of Space Marine, Guard, and other Imperial content. If you're interested in supporting the channel, I do have a Patreon page, and I really appreciate the support from my Patreons, because all of these videos do take quite a long time to make between recording, researching, and video editing, and it would be quite nice to make this as more of a full-time thing, rather than just a hobby I work on in weekends and evenings. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hope to see you guys in the next episode.